Our database project focuses on fantasy football. Fantasy football is a game where users draft NFL players and earn points based on their real life performance based on a point system decided by the league manager. The purpose of our project is to retrieve, store, and organize NFL player data in a structured way. Our system converts real player statistics into fantasy points using a points per reception scoring format. For this demo, we will only be creating 2 teams consisting of 8 players in an 18-week season. A challenge we faced was finding a way to fill the CSVs with accurate data, which we then overcame by feeding an AI link to official player statistics that then created a CSV based on the attributes we wanted.
Our entire schema design that we decided to go with for our fantasy app. One notable table I wanted to highlight was this roster slot table right here. Because of this week attribute that we have right here, it kind of lets users pick rosters on a week by week basis so that players change and it's not a static roster. Another table that I like to point out is the slot type right here. Because the slot type is associated with the roster slot, we compare the slot code with the player ID's position so that we can decide whether that player is allowed to be in that slot or not. So that kind of validates that. Another notable table is game, which allows to us to connect real players to their real time game stats, and so we kind of do real time analysis with that. Now, one shortcoming and issue that we had with our database was how to validate this roster slot because there's so many validations that need to be made. Of course, I already told you one solution with the slot type. Another table we used was light up rule, so that the league manager can set maximum constraints to the slot type itself. Now, those are all the tables I wanted to go over. Thank you.
Features of a full fantasy football platform. This includes getting the total score for that fantasy team for that week, as well as validating managers to assure that they're not entering the wrong players into the wrong roster slots. We do this by using 2 main procedures and 2 main triggers. Our first procedure is for validating player slot logic. This uses temporary variables and queries the roster slot as well as the player slot and assures that they're the same. For example, if a manager decides to try to put a running back into a quarterback slot, it'll give the invalid player insert logic, and it will not allow that insertion. This procedure is called using the 2 triggers. Or the first trigger is whenever before each insert on the roster slot, and it calls a procedure, and the second trigger is before each update on the roster slot, then it'll call that procedure. Our second procedure is for updating all the scores for that fantasy week. It takes input of the week that we want to update, and it goes and gets the total scoring line for that week for each player, adds them together, and adds it into the matchup entry, where it will then add it to the total score for that roster ID week. It can then be queried to get the total score for that week. For this example, we can use week 3, and we can call the procedure, and that'll add the matchup entry and total score, and then we can query week 3 and we can run it, and we'll see that roster ID 1 got a total score of 113 and roster ID 2 got a total score of 55, making roster ID 1 the winner.
Hello, here are some SQL commands that one might use for this database. This first one right here is to read the rosters and their details, like for example their players, their names, their positions, their team names, and it's specific for each week. So right now we're looking at week 3, but you can look for the rosters at week 7, week 10, etc. For this command right here, we read each player's total stats that they've accumulated throughout the entire league. So it shows their names, their positions, and all of their stats. And here is the third command. It reads the top 20 players for a given week based on their scores. So if we run this command right here, for example, we're looking at week 4. So the top player was Jonathan Taylor from the Colts with 35.10 points. You can also look at, let's say, week 7 if you wanted to, and they're same type of stats, but we're looking at week 7.
For user experience, we actually didn't get feedback from outside sources. Instead, we used our past experience playing fantasy football to influence how we structured the database. Overall, our own fantasy football experience acted as user testing, guiding us toward a database design that feels familiar, intuitive, and more transparent than typical fantasy apps. A challenge we faced was that although we had experience playing fantasy football, we found it difficult at first figuring out what tables and attributes were necessary to create a database that would work the way we intended it to.